So, hello everyone here and online. My name is Tuomo Alhojärvi. It's slightly awkward because if I'm looking at your faces, you're over there, and if I want you to see my eyes, I need to watch the camera. So you will find it a bit awkward, but I guess it needs to be all right. I hope it's all right. Anyway, welcome to the session, everyone. I will just first show to the online people our small group here in Finland, in Helsinki. We're here, a group of 5 people currently, and quite a number of people online. That's great. So today we're having a session on diverse economies of property and ownership. And the background of this session was in a research project we're having at the University of Eastern Finland, a project called Post-Ownership as an Interpretation and Experience of Economic Change. It's a project where we started in 2022, and it's funded by the Conne Foundation, and we're studying mundane, everyday alternatives to private ownership of things, of resources, of spaces, such as sharing economies or lending and borrowing of things and different forms of commoning. And we got this idea of arranging a session in Ljubljana, but we also wanted it to be very international and so to be very online. So we got the idea of having a hybrid session also as an opportunity to meet partly at least face to face and enjoy this company of people. Actually, all of the Finnish presenters today are working in the same university, but we're kind of spread out across the country. So it was also a nice chance to get together. And so we sent out a call for abstracts and asked around for interested people, and got some interesting responses from various scholars. So we have an exciting program today. The presenters will have their own titles, so not all of these are actual titles. Here you will see some of the themes on this slide. I'm just trying to minimize this screen. Okay, yeah. So we have 6 presentations coming up. First, we have Teppo Eskelinen from the University of Eastern Finland, speaking on definitions of property and community economies. Then we have Otto Brun, also from University of Eastern Finland, talking about coding and diverse ownership, legal studies. And then we have Mariana Pawlowskaja from the Hunter College at City University of New York, talking about changes in forms of property ownership in Russia, in Imperial Russia, Soviet Union, and post-Soviet Russia. Then we're going to have a 5-minute break approximately, and then continue a second session, so to speak, with Ella Liljeqvist from the University of Eastern Finland and University of Vaasa, talking about transformation of the economy and ownership in discourse. And we have Peeta Savinotko, also from the University of Eastern Finland, talking about diverse economy, diverse ownership in the making, public libraries lending more than books. And finally, we have Juhana Venäläinen, also from the University of Eastern Finland, talking about mediatized discourses of post-ownership. And as you see from the program, the 3 last sessions are related to this notion of post-ownership and transformations of forms of ownership, especially discourses and experiences of economy, where we move from or experience movements from private ownership of things to different property arrangements. And also discourses concerning that shift from private property to a different arrangement. But then we will first begin with 3 presentations on various crucial and interesting themes related to diverse economies and property and ownership in different contexts. regarding the practicals, so each presentation will last for approximately 15 minutes, and we'll have a short Q&A after each presentation, a couple of questions, and then we'll probably and hopefully have some time in the end of the session to have a common discussion between each other. And yes, so when we have the discussion, I especially encourage those who do not often hear their voices in such a meeting to speak up and step forth, and those who always hear their own voices in such meetings might consider giving some space to people who are not always speaking. That's important. But we'll get to that. We'll get to the discussion. But first, presentations and short Q&As. And as the program says, the first speaker is Teppo Eskelinen, senior lecturer from the University of Eastern Finland. Teppo, please, I will have your presentation ready in a second. Oops. Okay. Oops.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you, Tom, for the introduction. As said, I'm Teppo Eskelinen from the University of Eastern Finland, as everyone else seems to be here at the Finnish end. And my idea here is just to get this session started by saying something quite general related to definitions of property, possible definitions of property, and how they might be contextualized in the field of community economies. So something quite general, just to give the ground for more specific and more empirical questions. But I do think that this is something worth discussing in the context of community economies, to go through the very idea of what do we mean and what we could mean when we talk about the notion of property. So what does it mean intuitively, or by definition, to people to say, this is my property, this belongs to me? It's almost invariably interpreted in the judicial sense. That means that we have given legally oriented or legally based ideas on what property means, and we then have given kinds of conditions for the legitimate enclosure of goods to one's personal use. So they are given conditions for this enclosure. And
sorry, the slide is not showing to the online audience.
Share it again. Okay.
This one. But I think this is the full screen version, so let's see.
Does it show now? Yes, okay. So we, of course, do get all kinds of criticism of this judicial idea of property. We get criticism related to the inclarity or circularity of judicial ideas of property as legitimate enclosure of goods to one's personal use. This is, for example, David Graeber ridiculing the idea of property, saying that property by definition means that you can do anything you wish with your property, except for those things you cannot do, which means that we always have given kinds of restrictions to what property is, and the notion of property as such doesn't tell yet anything about these restrictions. Or we might have the diverse economies approach, saying that we need various kinds of new practices for sharing, common ownership, and so forth. Yet what seems to be common, even to these criticisms and the underlying judicial idea, is the key assumption related to this judicial definition. And that is that once the legitimate domain of user rights is defined, the individual is free to use the property as they wish. So there might be all kinds of challenges in in defining this legitimate domain of user rights, there might be various kinds of restrictions. To that, there might be all kinds of practices legitimately limiting these user rights, but nevertheless, at least in principle, if we could just define this legitimate sphere, the individual is then free to use the property as they wish. And this means that the most explicitly excluded idea from this definition relates to ethics. That is the question of how should property be used? What is the appropriate or legitimate way of using one's property, making use of what one owns? So the judicial definition excludes any reference to motivations or actual conduct as out of bounds of the question of property. The main question then would be only to define the legitimate domain of user rights, which means that you cannot use your property to hurt someone else, for example. That would be out of bounds. But in the traditional discourse on property, or the judicial discourse on property rather, we don't ask questions related to what is the right or acceptable or justified way of using one's property. And this is something I really believe we should consider as a possibility in somehow diversifying the notion of property as it's used today. Could the ethical sense somehow be part of the very definition of what property means, rather than being a separate question from its definition? And this seems to be particularly crucial within the sphere of community economies, where the main idea or the main approach is exactly that the hegemonic sense of an economic concept cannot be its singular meaning, but we should look at the various kinds of definitions and uses of the concept. So the question then follows: can we trace or locate senses of property or definitions of property or uses of the notion of property which would somehow open the possibility of understanding property as such, or definitionally or functionally, as related to ethical questions related to the proper use of what one owns, rather than the scope of one's legitimate user rights, legitimate enclosures to one's personal use. And I said, this ethical question is what is most explicitly excluded by the judicial definition. So few observations or theoretical points for inspiration for this debate. The first relates to young children. I don't claim to have much theoretical knowledge derived from parenthood or sociologically relevant ideas derived from parenthood, but something which strikes me as really interesting is how young children seem to understand the notion of property as they explore its very meaning. I found this very explicitly with my kids and their friends when they were younger than they are today. So for young kids, there seem to be two conflicting ideas of property as they form relations to objects they own. The one is the exclusionary sense, which means you're not allowed to use this. This is mine. It's my right to locate it somewhere where others cannot use it. Others cannot play with this toy, and this kind of enclosure follows from the fact that this is mine. The other sense of property is a given sense of responsibility, right? This is mine, so I have to take good care of this object. You most often note this in pets, but you note this also with dolls, but even in inanimate objects, like completely non-human objects like rocks or whatever. And this is my position. So I have a specific kind of responsibility to take care of it and show kind of gestures of nurture towards it. And these ideas of property seem to be in constant conflict in the sort of cultural mindset in these young children. And it doesn't, this kind of idea of property as nurture doesn't seem to be so much about value. You know, you have to take good care of this doll as it's valuable, and not so much even about conditions of use, how pedagogics often interpret the issue, meaning that you can take turns rather than just being so acquisitive. You can take turns in playing with that toy or doll or object or whatever. It really seems to be about a very specific kind of sense of responsibility directly implied by the very notion of property. But this naturally is quite quickly lost as we mature. But in young children, you note this kind of idea quite clearly. And you could note this in, again, another very unlikely field of inspiration when it comes to community economies, and that is theology. In contemporary theology, we find this emerging school of eco-theology giving or challenging the given idea of what does it mean to be the master or the owner of nature, as human beings are described in Christian theology. So the idea that the earth or nature was given to mankind can be and is interpreted in two very different and conflicting ways, either as to use it as one sees best or as bearing specific kinds of responsibilities of care. So if you go back to the Bible itself, it mentions the responsibility towards nature to till it and keep it. Till means gardening, not mere possession, but a responsibility to nourish. And there's a given gardener's duty related to care for nature given to man. So again, in this very unlikely context or unlikely inspiration, you find these conflicting ideas of what property can mean. And there's always the idea of property as signaling or involving given kinds of responsibilities, challenging the idea of property as exclusion of given goods for one's use. And the next possibility would be to go to the history of the notion of property. So if we look at the history of what property meant in Western thought, it seems that property didn't refer only to the possession of objects, but also to relations between human beings. Of course, the Roman law, talking about user rights, was a very influential one, but it wasn't the only sense of property existing if we look historically at the meanings of property. Rather, the context for property was often that there were social hierarchies, and property was not only an expression of these hierarchies, but also an expression of what is appropriate conduct towards people on other ladders on hierarchy. So property historically can be seen as articulating a relation and what is proper to do within this relation. Furthermore, we can see the notion of property relating to personal or class characteristics. If we look etymologically at the meaning of property, we find such meanings as nature, quality, distinctive, individual, or peculiar character of an individual or class. Going back to the Latin word meaning special character. So essentially meaning a quality or characteristic, but also in the sense of virtue, right? What kinds of characteristics does a virtuous and well-mannered or whatever person have? And we note this meaning again if we look at words derived from the same roots as property, etymologically, which are, for example, proper or propriety, all being normative concepts referring to given kinds of appropriate conducts or appropriate ethical characteristics a person could have. So looking at both contemporarily existing senses of property and the very origins of property, we find a stream of meaning in this very sense, referring to given ethical characteristics, ideas of appropriate conduct, and not only this judicial enclosure of giving goods to one's personal possession. Of course, much of this has been lost with later developments, creating a hegemony of capitalist ideas of ownership, abolishment of the idea that property implies what's proper conduct towards one's property. And we know that with modernity or early modernity, the word property slowly began to gain a new connotation, which is the current judicial one, meaning possession and being subject to ownership. And at the same time, or somewhat later, we also note the emergence of capitalist cultures and capitalist practices, which also enforces the idea of property as enclosure of goods. Here's one slide I won't have time to discuss, but I had something to say about John Locke. I can share my slides later if you wish. But my simple point related to poverty, property and community economies is that as we need to criticize and diversify and overturn hegemonic ideas of property, we have to discuss this also in terms of what does this imply for the very definition of property. So is there a risk that the notion of post-capitalist property relations casts capitalist property conception as the normatively given starting point? And would it be more fruitful rather to look at the historical and also to some extent existing expressions of another sense, another meaning, another tradition, meaning that property implies ideas about what is proper to do with a given object? So seen this way, questions about the meaning of property can involve a large variety of questions, including nurture, responsibility, and so forth. This does not mean that we would have property in other human beings, but as we have property in objects like trees, houses, or whatever, we enter a given and necessarily shared sphere of responsibilities of upkeeping, nurture, and a given ethical relation, ethical sense of upkeeping given goods. And so this is also a choice for community economies. As property is contextualized in the framework of community economies, both possibilities exist. We might look for the extension of the judicial sense of property, meaning that community economies call for various property regimes with different restrictions to the legitimate scope of enclosure. This means we diversify the ideas of what does legitimate property mean and diversify the existing practices related to use of given goods. Or we might look for some expression of the ethical sense, the question ultimately about the proper conduct with a given kind property. And it just could be that the ethical interpretation could be better suited for community economies, not least because community economies is largely as an approach or as an academic and political program about recognizing diversity in economic practices, not only extending existing practices, but diversifying the possible meanings of economic concepts. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Teppo. Thank you. What a great introduction to the concepts we're handling today. Any questions from the online group or here in Helsinki? We would have time for a couple of shortish questions for Teppo. Yes, Nadia.
I thought this was a kind of fruitful path to think about the ethics and the property and look at the root of the word, and another path could also be going back to Roman law. There is I've tried to write it.
So it seems that you got muted as you were talking.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. Well, I was just going to say that looking at the etymology in Latin law, there's also, I tried to write it into the chat. Let me see, did it go off? I'm not sure. Res communes, also there is a sort of ownership of land. There is a kind of res communes. I'm not sure if you see it.
No, we cannot see it on the chat.
It,
no.
There are concepts. Even in Roman law, there was a concept of some land belonging to everybody, not even to. There's something different from res publica. Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, it's there. Yeah,
there was public, but there was also common land which couldn't be even owned by the state or by the public sphere. And also there's a vast area of sort of non-capitalist, non-Western approaches to land ownership, which is not ownership at all. But again, in the Roman law, there was the usufructus, using the fruits of the land rather than owning it. So it's a very interesting topic, especially land ownership. So just a comment, really. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nothing really to respond. It's just to add to my points, I guess. But yes, we need all these ideas for diversifying and understanding the various possibilities related to the concept, for sure.
Yeah, thanks, Nadia. Anyone else? Questions, comments to Teppo specifically? Oh,
something's going on.
Oh yeah, Nadia is.
Yeah, it's just.
I finally sent it. I finally managed to send it. Thanks.
Yes, great. Thanks, yeah. Nadia. Okay,
I guess that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Teppo. We will continue with Otto Brun from the University of Eastern Finland. Otto is a doctoral researcher at the law school at our university, and I think Otto's presentation is here. I will just try to learn to share it again.
Can you all see my presentation? Nadia, can you show your thumbs up if you can see the presentation? Yes, perfect. Thanks a lot. So I'm in this presentation, I'm trying a little bit in the diverse economies kind of context, a little bit introduce the notions that are currently central or influential to scholarship on private law and the kind of property dilemmas that legal scholarship currently deals with. So I hope this is not too technical. Please ask me if there's some questions or something else at the end, and I'll be happy to clarify those, trying to keep it concise. So currently, there's been a great deal of consensus in this idea that some sort of sustainability transition needs to take place. And this transition is maybe most evident in the energy sector. The idea that these kinds of transitions that we might have seen in the past, with the amount of fuel wood used declining, we need to see something similar for that. And indeed, coal use, for instance, in Western countries has been reduced. So we've already seen something as a transition in the past that we can build on in order to envision these future transitions or future transformations. Indeed, we need to repeat this same idea. And this was also already an influential notion in the 70s and 80s, when early studies on the climate crisis were kind of envisioned that we've done transition in the past and it's possible to do again. And Jean-Baptiste Prévost in his recent book kind of problematizes this notion of transition, referring to how things become visualized through these relative scales, such as on the left, whereas indeed, if you look at what has happened to coal, these are numbers for the US, you can see that actually coal use is almost at a record high, whereas the graph on the left would imply that some kind of transition has taken place. And he argues that use of wood has gone through similar stages. So the transition that never happened, and that these different forms of energy are extently symbiotic in some sense. Well, why talk about the transition narratives in a presentation on property? The reason is kind of that sustainability studies and sustainability law has been very focused on this idea of transitions taking place. So this is from Hebbink et al., who describe this kind of X-curve effect. So we see the destabilization from the top left of the unsustainable leading to a breakdown and phase out, whereas then the new innovative come from the bottom left and leading to their institutionalization and increased use on the right. So these kinds of stories about transition are very influential. If you read work on the IPCC as well, they become very institutionalized as well in that sense. But the question is, do they represent some kind of fiction? And the link to legal studies is, of course, that actually legal studies have taken these ideas of a transition and translated them into questions of legal systems. So how does legal institutions such as property, private property, rights to property in our constitutions, how much do they represent something that has to become a thing of the past? These kinds of norms, do they have to be destabilized and phased out in order for some kind of sustainability to emerge, whatever we mean by that? And therefore, this plays in rather well with the recent, quite influential work on property in legal studies in general. Here are three examples. Brenna Bandar's work on the colonial lives of property, in the middle Jean-Philippe Robet's book on property, power, and politics, and to the left, Katharina Pistor's acclaimed work on the Code of Capital, where basically in all of these, at the core of current unsustainable and unequal orders are the institution of property, however it is understood, and clearly then also in order for some kind of more sustainable worlds to emerge, we need to reform property. Perhaps this is most poignantly spelled out by Andreas Malm with his kind of slogan-esque saying that property in its present form will cost us the earth, which is maybe more than argued in the context of the climate movement. So these kinds of notions suggest that that property needs to face this kind of destabilizing, breaking down and phasing out moment. But what I'm going to use the rest of the time to kind of look at what might that mean and how does that resonate with ideas within diverse economy frameworks, or how do the different ideas here play in. And this is linked then to the kinds of debates on property that are currently taking place within the legal scholarship and some neighboring disciplines as well, such as political philosophy. Legally coded property values and norms are a kind of key to questions of processes of transition and transformation. That's been well established. And globally, of course, we can see many kinds of different property norms. We can see historical property norms. Teppo here raised the question of these responsibilities, and I think in Catholic countries there is very well established this norm of a stewardship implied with ownership as a kind of key notions. In Nordic countries and North America, we've seen very influentially this idea of property basically being seen as and being theorized as a bundle of different things. So having property and being able to use it might be differently regulated. So then actually we see a kind of legal emergence of a difference in what you can hold and how you can use it, and the use can be regulated in different forms. Of course, then in legal pluralist theorizing, such as, for instance, indigenous ideas of property, this notion of property becomes even more flexible. At the same time, many of the authors involved in this renewed interest in property have been calling for a unitary conception of private property. So the idea is maybe a bit simplified, that property kind of needs to be called out as the heart of the problem in order to gather a kind of unitary response. For instance, Robet argues that property draws much of its normative and constitutional power from being defined in the negative. So as the power that is left when legal limitations are set, and that property limitations are the exception to the rule of being able to freely use what you own. And this then kind of highlights the current debate where some authors who want and try to see a kind of changing dynamic with regard to property are left to call out that this leads to a kind of new essentialism on property, where basically it becomes impossible to identify or imagine a changing sense of property. And of course, this goes also to the debates on what law is and what law does, where law is often conceptualized and idealized as this fixed order within, for instance, chaotic political processes, where law provides the stability for people to act and be able to have legitimate expectations of the future and therefore build their own agency. Whereas these kinds of questions of how much law is malleable or not seems to have quite important implications for that. of course, the notion of unsustainable orders then asks us to envision changing property in some way, and rather urgently, which kind of changes the notion of what law should be or can be. And here, the notion that I found helpful in kind of deciphering this is Katarina Pistor's work, where basically she argues that that property can be via the work of lawyers understood to code capital into forms that are more malleable, are more kind of durable, and therefore can act in ways which property in itself could not be able to. So it's this is the legal practice and agency which then constitutes this code of capital that Pistor argues that is the heart of the power of property. So Pistor argues that depictions of law as stable, almost sacrosanct, immunize from the public eye the work that is done more and more in private law firms and less in parliaments or even courtrooms, where lawyers are actually using forms of arbitration and the anarchic forms of private contract to kind of innovatize, build innovations within law and transform it in their daily practice. Interestingly, this decenters the notion of what property is in the way that it's much less about a kind of centralized state practice and a much more malleable sense of actors doing something with property, creating a world of possibility and excluding other aspects of it. Pistor's book ends on this notion that the increasing threat to law's legitimacy because of ever more unsustainable and unequal outcomes may turn out to be capital's greatest threat yet in this sense. And so where do we take this? And I think there are two different kind of directions that we can see this operating in the literature of today. One is here visualized by Maria Bartol's work, who's recently written this book on reimagining prosperity, and with her colleagues they created this white paper on a sustainable by design, which basically argues for a plural conception of property, where taking seriously this notion of the nexus between property and sustainability requires us to quickly innovate other forms of property, especially ones where this notion of stewardship and long-term interest becomes central instead of a kind of extractive short-term private interest. So there's actually a movement building around this this idea in the sphere. So that's one direction where actually diverse economy frameworks are put to use in a kind of practice of many different kinds of properties with a systematic agenda. But then there's the kind of other notion, maybe here illustrated by Andreas Malm's and Wim Carton's recent call for stranding assets that are unsustainable here in the context of fossil property. And this might be seen as a completely different strand or strategy. But interestingly, Ezra Rosser's work on destabilizing property maybe could allow us to find a bridge between the notions of diverse properties and other aspects. And this is something that I have been more and more investigating or analyzed in my own work, which deals with forest owners and how different kinds of claims on particular patches of land creates a situation where the expectations of commoners and non-owners are actually influencing ideas and expectations, building an expectation of responsibility, but also of organizing property in a way that would somehow take these non-owners' ideas and interests into account in a more diverse way. So actually, destabilizing certain forms of property, allowing non-owners in, might actually be quite compatible with the ideas of diverse properties mentioned before. So actually, I had some other conclusions, but I think I'll just end here in the interest of time. And I'm curious to engage in questions and comments later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Otto. Any comments, questions from the audience or online audience? Otto?
Well, if there's no questions, maybe you could say those conclusions.
Yes, sounds good.
Also, Mariana has her hand up.
What was that?
Oh, yes. Mariana has her hand up. Go ahead, Mariana.
Yeah, I didn't have, well, thank you. I didn't have a question, but more like a comment. I think it's really fascinating work, and I really appreciate the fact how I think this is what I got out of your presentation, that you can transform the regime without a revolution, and you can kind of code certain property relationships, and that is going to have significant consequences of how the regime is going to be operating. I think it's great to hear, and yes, I'm looking forward to hearing tomorrow conclusions.
Yeah, thanks. Now I'm more up to speed. Thanks. I was a bit lost in my notes. So thanks, Mariana, for that kind comment. So I think actually the sense that Katarina Pfister's work has opened allow us also to look at how this code and coding work that lawyers do can transform these very malleable notions, because law, as we know, is usually quite open-ended, general, and gives a margin of appreciation for courts and other actors that are then influencing it. And I think the way that we've been interpreting this code so far has been quite driven by interests that have kind of narrowed this scope and closed down these frameworks of possibilities. So I think the work that Maria Barth will open up for the way that these codes can be built and kind of performed differently is at least an interesting notion for people who engage in different ways with the law. So it kind of provides us with something of a more concrete appreciation of what's going on. I think this also is very much linked to the ethics ideas that Teppo was talking about before, the responsibilities that can be built in via this kind of way. But I also think it kind of, the third point I'd like to raise here is the sense of legitimacy crisis that property is facing actually gives a kind of revitalized interest toward the diverse forms of property that has been analyzed in the diverse economies frameworks for a long time. For instance, worker-owned forms of corporations or communal arrangements and others. And it feels like there's a new energy at least in the European property networks, which is basically the space where I'm located at the moment, to look into and build such institutions which are not so in a lot of sense, that's the conclusions I'd like to leave you, that's a space where there's a lot of energy now because of seeing that possibility for intervention. So maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Otto. That's great. Lots of ideas popping up. I really hope we will have time for a proper discussion at the end. But no, Mariana Pavlovskaya from the Hunter College at City University of New York. Mariana, I guess you have your slides.
No, I don't have slides.
You don't? Okay. Anyway, I will stop sharing and you can just, the floor is yours anyway.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to Omo for organizing us for this session. And I found two previous presentations to be very insightful and kind of enriching my thinking about solidarity economy in general and some of its aspects within Russia. So I'm going to be talking about work in progress, and in particular, I'm interested right now to look at history and significance of cooperatives in Russia, and looking at them as one example of solidarity economy. So cooperatives can be of different kinds, as you probably know. They can be worker cooperatives when workers own the enterprise themselves. They can be consumer cooperatives. They can be all these kind of different things. A very rich palette of forms and domains of life in which those cooperatives actually can operate. And they are often considered part of what is called solidarity economy. And solidarity economy is a set of economic practices that are not defined by profit only, even though worker cooperatives, for example, are for-profit enterprises, but making profit is not a major consideration. Other components of solidarity economy, as we discuss in this book that is coming in January, it's called Solidarity Cities, include community gardens, for example, right? Housing cooperatives, and many other institutions, community-supported agriculture, many other institutions that throughout centuries actually allowed cities to survive. So in this book, we are making a point that cities, even in the United States, which is this icon of capitalism, have always built with human solidarity, not with just racial capitalism alone. And it is this human solidarity and economic solidarity, institutions, practices, and everything is what allowed humanity to survive. And this is where our future hopefully lies, despite all these horrible things that are happening at the same time. So cooperatives, you know, they are a significant component of solidarity economy. But what puzzled me when I started thinking about it, they actually were very marginal in the former Soviet Union. The only form of cooperatives that I kind of knew existed would be collective farms. And those farms would rarely be autonomous institutions. They also would be under state control. And this is in addition to so-called state farms that were state enterprises under the control of the state. So, then in the current situation in Russia, cooperatives also are very, very marginal. And at the same time, solidarity economy, which is also a growing international movement, places a lot of premium on those cooperatives. So my question was, okay, what's up with cooperatives in Russia? And it turns out that cooperatives as part of diverse economy have always been recognized within Russia. And in fact, a lot of political economists, including Vladimir Lenin, for example, and Chayanov, they theorized economy of Russia as diverse. They used a specific term. In Russian it is uklad, and I couldn't find the direct translation to English for this word, which signifies a different type of economic practice. And this includes the type of economy. Let's say it could be agricultural, it could be industrial. It includes form of property, and it also includes organization of the enterprise. So these are characteristics that define this kind of type of a diverse economic practice. And property is one of them, important one, but it is not the only one. So this kind of opens this question of interaction of property relations with other social and economic forms and practices that kind of, you know, produce the results that are open and probably some possibilities. So, so even though economy is diverse and mixed, was recognized in this kind of Marxist and Russian Marxist scholarship, it was always considered to be temporary and something which is not good. So diverse economy was not considered as an asset for the economy of Russia. It was something that kind of is lingering there, and when time comes, the hegemonic type of economy prevails. And that considered to be, you know, kind of normal. For example, you would have feudal economy before capitalism, then under capitalism, capitalist economy would become hegemonic. Then under socialism, socialist or state economy would become hegemonic. So those were considered to be normal things. So diversity was always kind of on the margins. It was lingering there, but it wasn't appreciated as a kind of rich thing in itself that creates more diverse spectrum of economic life and possibility. So and then I was looking at some statistics about Russia and Soviet Union, and it turns out that in the beginning of the 20th century, Russia actually was leading the world in terms of the number of cooperatives. Cooperatives in Russia also had a specific term, like the name attached to them. It was called artel. And by 1917, which is the year of October Revolution in Russia, there were about 50,000 different cooperatives in Russia. And 25,000 of them were consumer cooperatives, 16,500 were credit unions. Then there were also 6,000 of different agricultural cooperatives, 3,000 of butter making cooperatives, and there were about 1,500 to 1,000 of different folk art cooperatives. Okay. What is also interesting is that 80% of those cooperatives in the Russian Empire were in rural areas. So we can see that the cooperative movement in Russia was largely a peasant movement. And the movement was actually so powerful that in 1906 and 1924, there were several cooperative congresses that were held in Russia. So what I'm trying to say is that that kind of non-capitalist organization of production was very, very vibrant at the eve of the October Revolution. So then my understanding was that after October Revolution, there was, using Otto's terms, you know, property relations were recoded, right, through law, very, very quickly in a very kind of aggressive way. So private property on means of production in general was totally eliminated, and several forms of socialist property were also created. But I didn't realize that actually until mid-1950s, still there were many cooperatives in Russia. I thought they were kind of eliminated after the October Revolution. But it turns out that in mid-1950s, there were 114,000 of different artels that manufactured many consumer goods that at the time in the former Soviet Union were in deficit. In fact, they accounted for almost 6% of output, economic output in Russia. And they manufactured 40% of furniture, 70% of metal cookware, which are like pans, I guess, and over 1/3 of different kind of knit clothing. So these are, yes, they also, there were also 100 design bureaus that were a part of, serving those cooperatives. And there were 22 experimental labs that did research, that would inform production of those goods. And even there were 2 scientific institutes, okay? So in 1956, a new law was adopted by the Communist Party and the Soviet of Ministers. And by 1960, all these cooperatives disappeared. Okay, so it was like such a compressed revolution without revolution, using again this kind of thinking, and which transformed property relations, right, and basically wiped out this form of solidarity economy that existed until the middle of the 20th century. So this is not that no cooperatives remained in the former Soviet Union, but some of them were those collective farms that I already mentioned that often only formally function as cooperatives, were organized as cooperatives, but were under the control of the state managers. There were some of this kind of folk artels still existing. There were some housing co-ops, but housing co-ops in the former Soviet Union, where state housing was provided, right, were actually more exclusive forms of cooperatives. So, for example, a lot of party bosses, their families, and kind of Soviet elites, they could have an apartment in a housing co-op, right? But regular people lived in state housing or in urban cities. And also, there were cooperatives still operating in gold mining, right? So as people going to Siberia and working on the mines, they still were organized into those co-ops. So, but in many other, okay, I'm going there. So then in 1986, right? So this is when the perestroika started. One of the first things that happened in Russia is that they allowed cooperatives to function again. And a lot of kind of non-state forms of ownerships were exactly in the form of those cooperatives. And today people have kind of very different memories of it because a lot of oligarchs, they came from those early cooperatives. Those cooperatives often were not genuine forms of collective ownership and work, but they were kind of, a way for someone to start a private business and then grow it to prominence. So, and today, cooperative forms of economy, again, are marginalized. So there is no kind of cooperative movement in Russia. There is none of that. And today, the hegemonic form, of course, is private capital under state control. So I guess all this makes me think about this relationship between property forms and actual economic practices. This is one question. So there is no kind of direct relationship between them. There is complicated relationship between them. This is one thing. And the other thing is that sometimes we kind of think of economic forms as being organic, and also solidarity economy and cooperatives, for example, kind of growing organically. And I think they are more genuine to human life. But at the same time, we can see how they can be produced through discourses and legal action and very deliberate policy. and they can be produced and they can be eliminated. So a lot of struggle about our economic futures has to kind of branch into all these other domains, because this is where very decisive decisions are going to be taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Great. There's already 2 hands up, so.
Yeah, clapping.
It's applause.
Oh, it's applause. Okay. I see.
It's nice
I'm
to
quickly learning to use Zoom in the year 2024. Okay, Nadia has a question. Go ahead, Nadia.
Yes, thank you, Mariana. I come from former Czechoslovakia, and so what you were saying was very, very interesting. We had a similar situation whereby there were many thousands of cooperatives in the country, and it is true that the communists really destroyed authentic cooperatives. It's strange that they remained in Russia for so long. With us, they also either disappeared in the 50s or they became not authentic pseudo cooperatives, as you mentioned also. And it is a paradox that today cooperatives are considered a communist, in my country, a communist thing, because the communists didn't like them. They were not really what they wanted. They just wanted state property, just as you said. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the book. Is there some mention of this also in your book, what you were saying?
No, thank you, Nadia, so much for your comments. The book is different. The book is about American cities. It's called Solidarity Cities, and I co-wrote it with my 3 colleagues who are one geographer, one economist, and one political scientist. And we look at 3 cities, New York, Philadelphia, and Worcester in Massachusetts. We use a lot of maps, kind of trying to make solidarity economy visible, and also make a point that it's been of great importance for all kinds of communities and their survival throughout the 20th century and now.
Well, it's a pity that this history is so much submerged, and nobody in our country, nobody even knew about these cooperatives which were here before the war. So it's a great pity. You know what came to mind in Dr. Zhivago by Pasternak? There is actually a figure, a person who is a pre-war cooperative activist, but I think he doesn't end well in the end.
Who is that? Okay, I'll ask you separately.
Yeah. So it's a submerged history which really should be written somehow. We should find some project for this.
We will work on that. Yes.
Thank you. I will be leaving now, so I also want to say thank you to all, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you. There's a question in the audience. Otto has something on his mind. I will just turn this.
Yeah, thanks, Mariana, for a wonderful presentation of a very interesting theme. I was wondering, do you know more about how these Russian cooperatives also organized in terms of social power? I'm also a fan of Chayanov's work, and I recall that there were all of these power plays in the late 19th century and early 20th century of how the immense social power of these cooperatives could be transformed in kind of dealing with a more and more authoritative Tsarist regime, and that then in the end some of Lenin's colleagues were kind of very proud that he, after a lot of wheeling and dealing and so on, managed to kind of have them on the same side, these groups that were very, very skeptic of the Bolshevik political project. But I wonder if you have a reflection on how the kind of cooperative organizing, that I don't know if there's ever been a place with more kind of cooperative organizing than there was in Russia in the period that you described. I believe at least that up until the 1920s, of how that kind of manifested, and I don't know if you sense the question somewhere, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yeah, I think thanks for the question. I think I think it is like very big topic, right? And I think today, as Nadia was saying, like a lot of it for some reason is forgotten. And in kind of communist party accounts of history of Russia before the revolution, cooperatives as kind of powerful institution, widely spread institutions, the one that existed in so many domains, right? From artists to like Volga boat towers or whatever it is, right? From very working class and people who have very little economic power to, I don't know, cultural elites. In fact, one of the cooperatives, just was called Big Artel, was formed by Decembrists, and I don't know if you're familiar, but it was like in 1825, there was huge aristocratic uprising against monarchy in Russia, and a lot of those aristocrats were sent to Siberia. And while in the colony and working, on timber and mines and all this kind of stuff, they formed this consumer cooperative that allowed them to support their families that were back in European Russia, cities and all this kind of stuff. So this is the form that they chose. And I think right now, yes, and also in the writings about Russian Empire, artel as a form of cooperative was mentioned, but it was never positioned as something which is so antagonistic to private capital, for example. So you would know artel, and then you have to dig out to understand that artel actually is a worker cooperative. So, and I think I'm just kind of beginning this research, but it would be very interesting to paint a bigger picture of the cooperative movement and its role in Russia. Also, I wanted to mention, and going to the previous presentation about property and ethics, I think what is also important is that a lot of private owners or cooperative owners in Imperial Russia, and then also this kind of seeped into former Soviet Union, were actually invested in ethics. So this kind of taking care of what you have, taking care of workers, taking care of collective farm members, that was very, very important consideration. So I think that is also kind of one of the areas that we need to look at and see how property forms are interacting with ethics in often very, very powerful ways. Because it could make a huge difference between the same property form, but when one is managed this way and the other which is managed in a totally destructive way. So I don't think it answers your question, but I kind of now only trying to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think there are plenty of interesting connections between the three presentations, and it also makes me think of legal practice itself as a kind of ethical practice, and or a kind of a commodity among other commodities that you sell if you happen to have that knowledge and expertise, and what kind of difference it makes whether legal practice is practiced as a form of commoning or not. But maybe we'll have a chance to get back to that. I suggest we have a small, maybe 3 minutes break, and then we continue 20 past 4 Finnish time. I don't know what time it is in everyone else's places, but in just 3 minutes, let's continue on post-ownership and what happens after private property. Okay, so I hope everyone is back or almost back. We'll continue. So in the second part of the session, we'll turn our attention more towards discourses and media representations of the economy and of different forms of property and ownership. And we'll look at how these courses, what they tell us about the changing and the unchanging forms of ownership in society. And first we have Ella Lilqvist from the University of Eastern Finland and University of Vaasa. And Ella, the floor is soon yours as soon as I remember how to share the presentation, which will happen soon. Hopefully, yes. It is happening live now, if this works. Yes.
Okay, hi. I hope you're seeing the slides correctly. I'm just gonna go ahead and make you even smaller. So yeah, I'm Ella Lilqvist and I'm a communication scholar, basically focusing on discourse studies. And this is something that I'm working on in the post-ownership project. So I'll just go ahead, and the title is not so good, so I'll just go into the introduction. So what I have collected a set of texts, a corpus that comprises stuff about sharing economy, platform economy, circular economy. So kind of try to find a way of compiling a corpus about texts that somehow talk about how the economy is changing or some kind of new forms of economy emerging, and also that these texts are something that have something to do with ownership. So it's just some quotation that I thought was relevant yesterday. I don't know if it is. So sharing economy and circular economy are considered new types of economies that have the potential to overhaul the dominant mass production systems and business practices with more resource efficient alternatives. So they have this kind of new thinking. Apparently, arguably, they have that in common. The kind of starting point assumption based on just personal experience and our projects thinking was that there's going to be some talk about ownership. So that's how I collected it. So it's collected so that there would be some talk on ownership. And theoretically, I'm thinking in terms of the concept of economic imaginaries, that these are changing, that somehow maybe performatively also changing the real world. But I'm not going to bother you with any kind of theory or method or anything like that. Basically, I have just examples on most of my slides. So maybe I'm hoping this will be more conducive to discussion, maybe. Let's see. But anyway, basically, I'm trying to look at how the discourses of economic transformation are shaped in relation to kind of traditional meanings of ownership, as well as maybe like sustainability, the idea that something needs to change because of the environmental situation, climate change, and that stuff. Those were kind of the starting points. I'm just through a couple of graphs. So this just to show in a minute that there's like this surge of interest in these types of of terms, concepts, and it kind of starts around the year 2015 to kind of go up. The line goes up. The same in kind of Finnish newspapers, 2015-ish. Not earlier than 2012 anyway. So it's just the same in academic publications as well, almost the same. This is from a paper by those authors that I have somewhere if you're interested. But yeah, just only point was that it's like a fashionable thing to talk about. It's like a hype discourse phenomenon, maybe. And basically, the concepts are a little bit vague. There's not very definite consensus on the definitions. Maybe there's a bit of unclear definitions in use, and maybe some of it is a bit misleading. Like in terms of sharing economy, our colleagues have discussed this as well. So here's just kind of my I kind of formulated these sort of definitions based on some research, but it's not exactly these people's. So the sharing economy is a kind of logic where goods and services are shared, usually by means of some kind of technological platform. And that's kind of the sense that a platform economy is the same. Sometimes the same, not exactly the same, of course. And the aim is kind of to optimize the use of resources. And the circular economy, in turn, is a much broader system where the efficiency of resource use is approached in a more global way, or like a more comprehensive way, to taking into account the different stages of production, use, and recycling of materials. But anyway, there's some links, and that's kind of my reason for including these in the same data set. You could, of course, argue that it also has some downsides. But anyway, there's like this expectation that this has some kind of benefit for sustainability, and there's this shared goal of improving resource efficiency through stewardship instead of ownership. So this kind of resonates with what we heard earlier. And you could also say that a sharing economy is a part of the circular economy in the kind of reuse part. The slogan is, of course, reduce, reuse, recycle. So my paper has this kind of empirical approach. I collected a lot of texts from the years 2015, 2023, and these are all in Finnish. So it's just representing the discussion going on in Finland during that time. And these are from traditional newspapers and from social media platforms, public texts. And there's a total of 1,300 texts. And I'm using a method called corpus-assisted discourse studies, but I'm absolutely not going to bother you at all with that, because if I use 5 more minutes to talk about that, it's only going to make it less clear. But basically, I'm looking at what kind of words are typical of this material, what kind of words occur typically together in this corpus, and also qualitatively at the examples that emerge this way. So So what I see is just a lot of definitions, a lot of discussing on what these terms mean and what ownership is. So a lot of the same stuff over and over and over again. Almost exactly word by word similar definitions, but with some variation. So in a lot of cases, there's just this idea that ownership is going to have a reduced role, or it has a reduced role, and there's some kind of alternative that's basically sharing, or like here, that the economy is based on services instead of ownership, so that goods are shared, rented, repaired, and maintained instead of always buying new ones. So that's basically the idea that comes again and again. And I also put the original quotes there in gray if the Finnish-speaking colleagues want to read those ones. So this is a lot of discussion what ownership is and what it isn't, but it's kind of, it's about the nature and supposed change of ownerships on a very general level. It's a kind of forward-looking, or maybe you could say aspirational discourse. Something like this. Explanation of the growing popularity of the sharing of economy. Ownership no longer brings status in society, especially for young people. So it's just like basically claims that something is changing, the imaginary of ownership is different or going to be different, but often it's like, of course, this is a tweet, so it's very short. It's apparently this was some kind of event and somebody was live tweeting, I guess, or something. So it's probably something that was said during that day. But like in a lot of cases, it seems to be like this very kind of giving like a statement, but not a lot of backing to it, if you see what I mean. In this, they are talking about young people, and this is like a theme that I see, that young people are portrayed as a driving force behind this change of imaginary. They don't care as much that they are changing the world because they don't care about owning stuff. But it's like they are, all young people are the same in these texts. So it's kind of very uncritical. It bothers me. Like actually found exactly one text that had a different perspective, and it was based on an actual a study. Well, not an academic study, but it was based on some kind of survey or something. And they had found that actually there are very different kinds of young people. Like young men are very interested in owning stuff, something like that. So it was surprising, or maybe it's not surprising, but kind of interesting that there was only one example that I could find of that kind. Oh my God, sorry about all the text. Anyway, I guess I already basically said that these are like, seems like statements of facts, but they don't really often put up, not a lot of evidence or kind of backing to those claims are provided. That's the repeating the same slogans again and again. And the kind of what I wanted to also say about that is in this discourse, it's often like it's unclear who the supposed owner or the person who is no longer an owner is supposed to be. So it's just, I wrote here, sometimes deliberate vagueness, but I'm sure it's not deliberate. That sounds very naive, but like I was frustrated, so So I had this tinfoil hat sort of interpretation. I'm sure it's not actually deliberate. But anyway, the critical perspectives are quite rare, it seems to me. And actually on that first example there in green, it's a bad translation because in Finnish it's a passive form. It's not people, it's just like in general passive, like they want to get rid of ownership. But in that example, it's actually companies. It's actually like Uber and Airbnb that want to get rid of ownership. So in a lot of cases, it's like the consumers who don't want to be burdened by ownership. And in a lot of cases also it's the companies. So you don't really necessarily know always. But there was a couple of examples, criticism I found, like the low example is that, okay, I'm almost out of time now. I'm just gonna maybe quickly just say, I'll try to look at what they say about change, and like in terms of the words like solution, promote, enable, there's like a lot of kind of very positive sounding words and thoughts when you look at the examples as well. And some kind of cultural change driven by environmental concern. And then I also try to look at what is not owned anymore, or what is the object of ownership, and usually it was cars actually. And of course, Johanna is going to talk about cars probably.
No, actually not today.
Not today, no mention of cars, okay. Well, he knows a lot about the cars. But like, basically that was a huge chunk of the discourse was about that mobility aspect. And what they didn't talk about was owning housing. So I thought that was quite interesting, but there is some talk about housing, but it doesn't support the idea that some kind of imaginary is changing. And what I didn't find at all was kind of any talk about owning land or financial assets. And basically that was it. And my points. Is it like, it's very vague and ambiguous in many ways. And it's also optimistic and kind of seems to, in a lot of cases, support this techno market climate imaginary, meaning that the market and technology is going to save us. And young people were portrayed in an optimistic way. And one thing that I found interesting was kind of that the cultural, social, and psychological aspect of ownership, like it being like a significant thing for forming identities and like expressing yourself, and also economic security and stuff like that. Like that's not discussed almost at all that I could find. So how do you suppose there's this change if it's like a very important thing, part of a culture, and then suddenly just you have generation, what is it? Z, Y, I don't know, there's all kinds of letters. But anyway, the young people are going to change it, never mind how important it was before. And of course, all the changes happening within the kind of confines of current capitalism, and it's not the idea of private ownership or private properties that is being questioned in any way. Obviously, that was clear, I think, to everyone. Yeah, so basically that was it. We need to somehow think about how to make this public discussion somehow more, bring out more perspectives, make it more polyphonic, because it's just like I've been very disappointed with the text that I've been reading, and people know who have listened to me talk about this earlier, but it just somehow it felt disappointing, but maybe it has some value in itself to try and think about what is the kind of nature of this kind of maybe fashion discourse or type. What is this anyway? Thank you very much.
Please stay for a moment. Let's get our pictures back. Thank you, Ella. That's fascinating to look at this kind of bigger scale data in terms of discourse. Mariana, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Stop the share. We can see
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Ella. That was so interesting and also so kind of rich in terms of uncovering various views of young people on property. And I'm kind of taken by the fact that they don't want to own things, right? So that seems very interesting. However, how do you think this is related to kind of the nature of society, and is it contributing to greater equality or inequality? Because I'm thinking, okay, they don't want to own, but there are people who want to own and want to control, and they just gonna take it, right? So if it's up for grabs, then they're gonna come and take it. So what do you think about it? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I don't believe that very much. Like it's like a statement that the text that I had have in my corpus have a lot of this talk that young people don't want this, and I don't really think that's true necessarily. I think it's just like this belief or this slogan that they keep repeating. Of course, a lot of young people think it's important to like be more sustainable. So in that sense, like maybe they try to buy less things, but there are others who don't feel that way. So it's just like it just doesn't seem like a very well thought out position. But you're very correct that there's always like somebody's owning these things, and that was one of the points I wanted to make. Like also like they don't very often discuss that critically, like how does it make ownership less important if we still have the concept of private ownership and somebody's still owning it? And yeah, I don't know if it has like, I don't know what the impact, like what if it has a really big impact, but it definitely can have some impact if it gets if it's really like something that actually gets very popular. But I don't know, this whole thing is more like the whole corpus speaks more to kind of how this has been talked about rather than the actual reality that's been going on out there. So I don't think you can really like necessarily talk about them at the same time. It gets a bit confusing. I hope that answered at least some.
Can I something add a question? I will try to come to the camera. I think it's also fascinating in terms of performativity of discourse, because often in diverse economies we talk about discourse as being performative, as creating worlds and not only describing them. But this, to me, one of the most fascinating things here is that if you look at a kind of large corpus, a large scale discourse analysis, you find out that most of what we talk and write is actually quite generic and banal and not worth saying in a sense. And
it's not too critical.
Okay, I'm exaggerating, of course, but generic. Kind of not adding too much, kind of circulating those tropes about certain economic concepts and so on. So it makes me think about performativity theory in relation to discourse analysis, and to what extent that is kind of biased on a methodological by level by concentrating on certain texts and close reading methodologies. And once you look at these kinds of materials discursively, you have another kind of discursive reality popping up.
Yeah.
But maybe there's also a question there, because it makes me think of Otto's graphs about energy sources just adding up and not really kind of displacing each other. And my question was, to what extent do you see that these concepts are just kind of adding up to and not really replacing other concepts? Because all of your figures kind of were going up, but are we just communicating more? Are we just kind of writing more into social media and kind of having all sorts of concepts more? Or what can you say something about that?
We have more concepts and they are replacing it. I don't know, but like apparently there is some research in terms of like sharing economy showing that it doesn't necessarily replace that. You just get a bigger market. Like, for example, Airbnb doesn't replace hotels, but you get people traveling more if there's like more inexpensive choices. So in terms of like the actual impacts, then it's complicated, obviously, to evaluate, but I think there's some indication that at least it's not that simple, like you have more sharing and you have less environmental impact necessarily straight away. I don't know if that was anything to do with what you asked, but
yeah.
Okay.
Johanna, go ahead. Shorties.
Yeah, thank you, Ella. I think it's actually quite interesting your observation of how this kind of economic transformation discourse operates with this kind of empty slogans. And I was wondering, just like methodologically, do you have any ideas if we could trace the origins of where these slogans come from? Because that could be interesting in trying to understand who has power, what kind of actors have power to spread the discourse.
Well, kind of locally, like I know that in the Finnish language text, a lot of the circular economy things come from Sitra at least, and not, and there's overlap, so probably also they're sharing stuff, but I'm sure that then those come from somewhere else, and you could just like probably look into some of their documents to know from where. Yeah, but then obviously when it's in another language, then this data set doesn't help with like where it came from before everything comes to Finland from somewhere. Nothing is invented here except for sauna.
So it would basically require a lot of manual work, tedious work to try to trace them. So there's no kind of automatic.
Well, there's no. Well, there's some things you can like find like the same bits of text that can help a little bit, but obviously as soon as when it changes significantly, then you just have to understand the context and the content, I guess.
Thank you, Ella. Yes. I think we'll need to move on, so we have time for Pieta and Johanna, and I hope we'll have time to take a bit of discussion time in the end. But Pieta, please, the floor is yours, so to speak.
Thanks. Yeah.
Are you
I
able
will
to
share.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry. try again. I should be able to see my slides, which I'm not. So I'm now struggling.
I will. Can you see our picture? I can change to this.
Yeah, but I still don't see my notes.
Oh, okay.
Which is what I would like to see. Just a moment.
Is it working?
Yeah, but I'm sorry, not for me. For the audience, other than those who are present in the room there, I should have been there also, but I'm having a small flu, so I'm now presenting from home, which means also that I don't have like all of my brain cells with me, so I really need the notes. And I have done this before to see the notes when I share, but now I don't remember how it goes.
What if I show your presentation from this computer? Does it help?
Yeah, that would sound good.
I would need your presentation.
Yeah. Shall I email it to you, or what is
Yes.
your
Is it
suggestion?
possible for Johanna to go first so I can? Yeah, so I can do that in a minute.
Yeah, sorry for this
Yeah, no
hassle.
problem. So instead of Pieta, we'll have to wait a bit for Pieta, and we'll have Johanna first. Johanna Venäläinen, also from the University of Eastern Finland. As almost everyone here. Okay.
Okay, so hello everyone online and in this room. My name is Juhana Venäläinen. I'm based in cultural studies at the University of Eastern Finland in Joensuu. Actually, I'm kind of continuing along the same topics that Ella already opened up. So I'm going to talk about mediatized discourses of post-ownership with a little bit different data set. It's been manually collected actually by Pieta, who will talk after me. And it's based on this kind of Finnish leisure and sort of women's magazines and how people discuss their relations with their personal belongings. So kind of ownership of tangible objects and how people reflect on the question of whether to own things or whether to get rid of things, basically. So this is also part of the research project that was also already mentioned by Tuomo in the introduction of this session. But if you were not here, I could just say a few words about this project. So it's funded by Kone Foundation and running until 26. And we are interested in the questions of how did the idea of post-ownership emerge? How and why is it made culturally appealing, and how is it organized, interpreted, and implemented in everyday economies? And we're looking into policy and academic discourses of post-ownership, as well as media representations. And also we are trying to do this kind of a small ethnographic sub-research sections on different post-ownership practices, such as abandoning car ownership and about libraries and their tool lending and shared facilities, and then Tuomo is doing research on the use and creating urban commons. So basically the whole research team is present here today in this session. So maybe first a few words about the notion of post-ownership, because that's many times something that raises kind of questions quite legitimately, I would think. So by post-ownership, we refer to a discourse that emphasizes the obsolescence and burdensomeness of private ownership. Instead of accumulating possessions, post-ownership advocates for minimizing commitments to tangible assets and embracing flexible forms of co-use and sharing. In practical terms, post-ownership is visible in practices where resources are shared and maintained outside of traditional ownership frameworks. So I'm thinking of practices such as borrowing, renting, and different kinds of co-use. And these kind of non-proprietary practices related to resources and belongings reframe property as something socio-cultural and socio-material. So it's not just a legal relationship in the simplest sense, but instead we see that property is embedded in relationships and practices where the line between owning and simple having access is many times blurred. So while the ideas of post-ownership have been increasingly popular in the last 10 years, as Ella showed in her presentations, like beginning from the 2014 maybe, it's also quite easy to trace back and see the roots of this discourse slightly further in their historical trajectories. So thinking, for example, of Jeremy Rifkin's The Age of Access or Michael Heller's The Gridlock Economy. These kind of works in the early 2000s envision a shift where ownership would lose its centrality as economic structures increasingly favor access over possession. Then quickly going forward in the 2010s, we see the rise of the sharing economy, which kind of highlights the more communal aspects of the economic action and all kinds of alternative ownership models. And then now coming to the late 2010s or early 2020s, the focus has shifted maybe more on the critical perspectives on the power of the big platforms, for example. So even with the changing rubrics and the shifting perspectives from the more affirmative, like the sharing economy talk in the first phases, and now coming to the more kind of critical ideas, I would say that there's a clear trajectory of interrelated concepts which aims to capture and define the turbulent dynamics of property and ownership. Also, in context of self-help literature and the so-called productivity guides, the ethos of post-ownership manifests itself in form of minimalism, which is often promoted as path to personal freedom and success. Books like Marie Kondo's The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up popularize the idea that fewer possessions mean a lighter and more fulfilling life. Critical perspectives, of course, often suggest these kinds of books and trends within neoliberal capitalism, arguing that they align with the individualistic and consumerist values. But at the same time, they also suggest an emerging set of values, which is post-materialist and where happiness is in a way decoupled from material accumulation. All in all, we can see a lot of instances in contemporary culture and media where ownership is presented as a burden rather as a guarantee of freedom. Especially in the marketing speech of the various sharing businesses, freedom from ownership can be even positioned as a kind of a luxury, which promises a sense of liberation from the responsibilities typically associated with personal property. For example, this front page advertisement from Helsingin Sanomat showcases Biili, a Finnish car sharing business, which is known by its sarcastic advertisements. Here, the ad is ridiculing private car ownership by referring to its unexpected costs and general unpredictability, contrasting that to the luxury of not owning a car and knowing exactly how much will be spent per month and that the car also works, basically. The idea of tangible possessions as a burden is curiously similar to what the sociologist Georg Simmel wrote already 100 years ago in The Philosophy of Money, observing that whoever invests his money in a picture gallery or training stables no longer has a completely free existence. So for Simmel, material possessions may enhance freedom, but simultaneously they impose new constraints and obligations. This critique now finds new relevance in today's discussions as marketing campaigns for sharing services echo these Simmel's insights, presenting ownership as potentially burdensome commitment rather than unquestioned asset. This evolving view of ownership could open up or perhaps revitalize an idea of property as relations of care. I think a theme that Teppo already opened in the first presentation of this session. So here, taking care of one's possessions is kind of a central practice of taking care of the self, to paraphrase Michel Foucault, but also it becomes a broader practice of responsibility and interconnectedness rather than a matter of hierarchy or control. So ownership would again become an expression of mutual care, which would challenge the modern idea of property as a rigid and individualized claim. So now in our empirical analysis, I hope that I still have some minutes for that. We wanted to ask, first of all, how are the circulating discourses of post-ownership translated into everyday economic thought and practices? And second, how is post-ownership produced and contested as a cultural idea? And this is the data that we have used. So we have used the digital archive of Sanoma Media Finland, and Pietro has collected about or gone through about 2,000 issues of these magazines, and then done a full text search of them with several terms related to ownership sharing, decluttering, and so on. And from this collection, we got about 5,000 hits, of which 700 were saved as excerpts, and about 300 were saved as sort of key texts or full texts. The data or the articles, they include a wide range of objects commonly discussed in relation to ownership. They talk about homes and gardens, but they talk a lot about this kind of personal items as well, like clothes, books, mementos. And all these categories reflect also the diverse roles that the possessions play in people's life. So this variety underscores how different ownership practices actually intersect with the basic needs and identity and lifestyle of people. And then we have tried to identify three kind of main perspectives that characterize post-ownership, especially through its affective dimension. And this we have called voluntarily simplification, resisting minimalism, and then forced abandonment. So basically, I've selected like three quotations and some interpretations out of them. This is the first one. KonMari promises that letting go of possessions will revolutionize your entire life. When chaos is tamed, you gain the strength to eliminate unnecessary worries, annoying jobs, and energy-draining relationships from your life. Marika believes that once the items have been sorted, life can focus on the more important things. Ski trips in the forest, morning coffee at the shelter, winter hikes with dogs. I always get happy when I see a squirrel. You don't see it if you constantly have to put things in place. So basically, this kind of emphasizes in a funny way how intensively affective these things, these relations with stuff can be. And for this person, if the home is not in order, she cannot even see the squirrel in the forest. So it's a really intensive and internalized understanding of post-ownership as a route to personal freedom. And the discursive registers related to this, like letting go of commitments for having a peace of mind, abundance of material possessions as an individual, but also a kind of a societal problem, minimalism as a contemporary and efficient approach to ownership, and questioning the need overall of extensive personal possessions for gaining happiness or gaining higher social status. Then the next one, resisting minimalism, basically tries to oppose what was said in the first category, or the first discourse. Quotation goes again. If saving items brings you joy, you can just forget about decluttering and organizing. Items always find a use when the right time and place come. It's not about money. In addition to joy, perhaps the most important thing about items is the stories. Each item has its own story, and that's great, says Wilhelmina. I can tolerate uncertainty very well. You don't always need to have strict control in this world. So this is interesting, because here having a lot of things, having an abundance of material possessions is kind of connected to not having to have a strict control of things, and then this kind of KonMari thing where you have to kind of be really like rational and coordinated to get rid of everything that's extra is kind of being portrayed as an opposite to this. So in this second discourse, it aims to counter the glorification of letting go, and the first discourse, in which the abundance of possessions kind of requires explicit justification. And here, what is highlighted is the intrinsic value of material diversity and the uniqueness of objects. Also, sort of social critique of the decluttering culture, which is compared to having a kind of an endless diet. Aesthetics of abundance and coziness. Sometimes they talk about maximalism in contrast to minimalism, and also the kind of the emotional difficulty of letting go of things. And then the third one of these, forced abandonment. So of course, it's not always the case that people just voluntarily try to get rid of extra things, but it might come because of necessity. And in this case, it's because there's a mold problem in the home, which is discussed in this article, and the person is describing the emotional difficulties in having to leave all the stuff that it's so important to this family. So scripts from plays, calendars from 10 years ago, old dream maps, and end up in the fire. And then she says, although I did forced KonMari, getting rid of stuff felt surprisingly good. It was also somehow easier because it was trendy. So I think this is kind of a proof that this performative works in a way, even if it operates with these empty slogans, that it makes it easier to get rid of things when you need to, even if it's not your own choice in the beginning. So this is about having to dispose belongings due to unforeseen events, like indoor air problems, financial issues, illness, fire, death of a loved one, emigration, intergenerational transfer, and so on. And here the discursive registers are about emotional connections and memories tied to the items, coping, survival, mental toughness of being able to leave things, and detachment from materialism and starting your life afresh. So what is coming to all these three discourses, that managing ownership is seen as a sort of a culturally shared experience of care, obligation, and living a good life. And there's a lot of intensively affective meaning making with material objects, where the biographies of things, the kind of the world that the things have seen, will enmesh with the life stories of the people who are narrating these stories. And there's also this tactical use of these circulating post-ownership discourses, which kind of succeeds in diversifying and subverting prevailing notions of cultural desirability of property accumulation. So losing possessions was easier because it was trendy. Maybe I will end in this slide. So these media representations that we have analyzed of post-ownership, they echo the sharing hype and this idea of going beyond ownership, which already starts in the early 2000s, but it also challenges and reshapes them through the perspective of people's kind of ordinary economies. And methodologically, epistemologically, I would say that examining this socio-material forms of ownership helps us to understand the complexity of transitions to post-ownership or other kinds of alternative ownership models. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. Thank you. We would have time for one comment or question as I change presentations to get us. Yes, Teppo.
Yeah, thank you. This is a highly interesting analysis, but I was thinking here, when you locate these discourses and look at these media content, is it always objects that people are talking about, like tangible material objects, or does the discourse of post-ownership extend to issues like housing, or, and as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country owning forests, for example. So you know, it seems as if the most valuable of possessions and those possessions which can also cause all kinds of concerns for people are left out of this discourse, and as if this discourse was only about things in your apartment, right? So material objects.
Thank you, Teppo. This is a very good question. I think like quantitatively, this kind of smaller objects are quite a bit emphasized in the material, but as I see it now, when just looking at through the media, I also see like this kind of platform startups talking about housing as something that the kind of the older norm or kind of a cultural idea in Finland of having your own house or your own property is kind of outdated as well in this kind of advertisements, and they kind of recycle this exactly the same wordings and use it as a kind of template in trying to think that everything that has been in the realm of private property can be platformized in a way.
Yes, that's an exciting connection. I think I have Peter's slides here, and we have 17 minutes to go. So I will
Thank you.
The floor.
Yeah, Tuomo, can I figure it out? It's easier if I share them myself, so I can switch them when I want. Yeah.
Go ahead. Let's try it again.
Yeah, let's try it again.
Does it work?
Oh, no.
No. Okay.
No, sorry.
Yes.
Hey. Just a minute.
Okay.
Okay, now it seems to work. If you are not able to see my notes, but I am, then it's working. Great.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, nice to be able to present, even though it would have been nicer to be there, but now things are how they are. So I'm going to talk about diverse ownership in the making, is my title, Public Libraries Lending More Than Books. So as been told, I've been working in Johanna's project together with Tuomo and Ella, although for this academic year I have been mainly teaching gender studies, so not so fully engaged with this, but I have anyway managed to write a manuscript for a book chapter based on my research on libraries, and this presentation is kind of based on that. But actually, when I submitted the last version of the manuscript few weeks ago, I wasn't too happy with the outcome. So if there are some comments or questions, I will be very pleased So, so in my research, I have approached ownership from a perspective quite heavily influenced by diverse economies. So ownership, like other economic fields, is diverse rather than uniform, subject to change, haunted by capitalocentric or rather privatocentric imaginaries, meaning the hegemony of private property and private ownership in the meaning making of owning. And from this diverse economic perspective, libraries can be seen as contributing to the diverse situated material discursive formation of ownership in many ways. Libraries can be seen as information commons or as a free public space, working kind of against the privatization of knowledge or privatization of urban space. And these are important and also well-studied perspectives, but I find it curious that less research is, or at least seems to be available on the rather obvious aspect in the library ownership axis, that is actually lending books and other objects, which is what libraries do, or at least so-called lending libraries. There are other types of libraries as well, but those may be most common type of libraries. They lend things. So in my research, I focus on the tangible kind of rudimentary forms of ownership, the access to, use of, and care for physical objects. And I'm interested in how do libraries shape the understandings and practices of owning things. But this said, I don't think of libraries as kind of independent actors floating in free will, but as institutions embedded in the cultural and political landscape. And I will get back to this. So in my study, I have focused on a rather new activity in libraries, lending objects or items other than books. Even though there has been, for example, tool and toy libraries in the US from the 1930s and 1940s, object lending became more popular in libraries in the 2010s. And this time frame and also other things connect this phenomenon to the post-ownership discourses that Juhana was talking about. I'm here talking from the perspective of Finland, where my research is situated, but this seems to apply to at least to other Nordic countries and to some other parts of Europe, at least. Maybe if there are some people from other parts of the world, you can tell if object lending is or has become a thing in your libraries as well. In Finland, you can find a public library from every municipality, and almost all of them have at least some non-book items in their collections. Most often some sports equipments, musical instruments, or tools. But I also include in object lending the different things that one can nowadays use inside the library, meaning like printers or 3D printers, sewing machines, or some bigger libraries even have well-equipped maker spaces. But however defined in terms of loans and collection size, these kinds of objects still play quite a marginal role when compared to books and other kind of traditional collection items. But even if small in numbers, this object lending has gained quite much visibility in the media, and also it has caused controversy in libraries. By its opponents, it is seen as a threat to the library as a treasurer of literary culture. And from the perspective of this research, this kind of peculiarity and controversiality of object lending provided quite rich data, which will be the next slide. Yes. So I have interviewed 13 librarians and other library professionals from different libraries across Finland, and the libraries were chosen based on their outspoken interest in object lending. And I conducted semi-structured interviews, also walked around in the libraries with the interviewees. And now in this analysis, I have focused on the justifications and rationalizations of object lending in libraries. As I told, object lending is new and controversial, so this kind of talk was quite abundant in the data. And I also here use some Gibson-Graham methods, or I analyze this justifying and rationalizing talk from the perspective of diverse ownership. So instead of looking for one discourse or form of ownership, I was kind of open to the differences, open to the various configurations of ownership. But I categorized these justifications for object lending according to a scheme of kind of 3 different aims of the Finnish public library institution, which I formulated based on previous research. So this was kind of the framing that helped me to approach libraries as cultural and political actors with particular histories and as situated in particular social political contexts. So first, object lending was justified from the perspective of the civilizing aim of the library, where library is seen as an educator cultivating civilized citizens. Object lending encourages in this discourse the patrons to learn new skills, for example, repairing clothes or using digital devices. And it also, especially the objects that were used inside the library, they supported also social skills, mutual understanding as the devices brought different people together. Well, this was one of the objectives here. But not only skills were taught, object lending was also seen as teaching the patrons a new mindset, especially in relation to owning and buying things. That private personal ownership is not always necessary, and that consumption might be ecologically detrimental, whereas collective ownership brings about these various benefits. So by lending objects, the library saw themselves as kind of initiators of social change. They aimed at showing a way to a world where one doesn't have to own everything, as it was often put in the interviews. And this kind of reasoning, I think it carries quite strong resemblance to certain discourses of sharing economy and commoning, where private ownership is discouraged and somewhat thought of as somewhat like old-fashioned, and then collective ownership is understood as kind of leading the way to ecologically sound and socially flourishing futures. But this was not the only way object lending was justified, and also not the only way how ownership figured in the data. In the contemporary Finnish public library, promoting equality is understood as a central aim, reflecting the welfare state ethos. The library institution in Finland was actually developed to its current form in the golden era of the welfare state. So also in my data, equality played a key role. Object lending was justified as a way to offer equal opportunities for everyone to gain access to certain items, and therefore gain access to learning new skills and participating in various cultural and physical activities. And even though it was important for the libraries to offer this possibility to everyone, regardless of their income or wealth or any other difference, this access to objects in libraries was seen especially valuable if one couldn't afford buying them. So it seems that the libraries kind of recognize the inequalities that are connected to private ownership, that the possibilities to own are unequally distributed, and that not being able to own can lead to certain inequalities, such as limited cultural or political participation. So unlike when looked through the civilizing frame, here the private ownership is not seen problematic as such, but the issue is the consequences of its unequal distribution. So here the ownership model promoted by the library is maybe not so much collective ownership, kind of through commoning and sharing, but public ownership, which is seen to ensure the equal access for everybody. So third, according to many research, libraries are now more and more affected by neoliberal management, which inflicts the kind of market-oriented agency. And I kind of recognize the paranoia in this kind of analysis, and I refuse to understand libraries and their aims as kind of exclusively or even extensively dictated by neoliberalist values. But however, object lending was rationalized in the data also as a way to attract new patrons and to increase the number of loans, which are the key kind of performance indicators for libraries in this era. It was not only the lendable objects themselves, but also kind of the culture of borrowing and sharing that was presented in the libraries as attractions. They kind of enable new exciting experiences and then therefore help the library to compete in the so-called experience economy. In a way, this can be understood also as leaning towards the discourses of sharing economy, but kind of from an individualistic and consumer-centered perspective. Rather than building kind of flourishing communities or communal futures, the aim of object lending is to attract individual customers. And the criticism towards private ownership was here not visible, or even on the contrary, because object lending was also justified as a way for the patrons to try before they buy. So they can come and try various devices and then decide if they want to go and buy them, to own them privately. So here I think owning or not owning is not construed as a matter of individual, it is construed as a matter of individual choice, and libraries' role is kind of to widen the selection of available ownership modes. And maybe this is the section that I'm not so happy with and could use your contribution. Like what then? What are the conclusions? At least we can see that different conceptions and valuations of ownership can coexist in this kind of a frame of the library. And maybe this points to the kind of vagueness or multi-sidedness of ownership as a concept or phenomenon, which also maybe was seen in Ella's presentation as well. Then we can also see that libraries have diverse agency in relation to ownership. We can even build kind of hypothetical trajectories of ownership cultures, maybe promoted by these object lending libraries. Like that the civilizing mission shows how the library can contribute to the cultures of commoning. And then library as a promoter of equality can be understood as advancing redistribution of resources, using taxpayer money to make objects publicly available for everyone. And from this market-oriented perspective, library can be seen as contributing to the servitization of resources by offering object lending service among other providers for customers to choose. So maybe we can say that object lending in libraries can be a tool in reconfiguring ownership, but which direction is open to debates and tied together with the overall development of the public library institution. This kind of a vague conclusion, but that's better. I don't have any better for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Excellent. Let's take some time for discussion, although we are over time. If anyone needs to leave at this point, I thank all the participants now, but let's continue for a while to have a proper discussion for some minutes still, if you're able to join us. So any questions, comments from the audience or from the online audience? Peter.
I have a good question.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Pieta. That was very interesting. My question, however, is so how lending books is different from lending all these other objects? Because it seems like books can be thought of those cultural items that also were always shared and all this kind of stuff. Are you drawing parallels between them or seeing some differences?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. First of all, in the libraries, there is a clear distinction between books and these kind of other objects. And of course, libraries are not only like books are not the only kind of traditional collection items in libraries. Libraries, at least in Finland, have been lending magazines and recordings and also some like console games and stuff like that for quite a long time. But these are seen in the libraries as having like some cultural or information value. So they are seen as cultural or information products, and that makes them different from these items that are more like practical items or then connected to something that is done with the item. Of course, this is like a not a clear distinction, because of course items are also, like all items, are also have some cultural value and cultural connections. But in this study, I thought that like maybe at least focusing on items other than books maybe can bring like better forth the ownership issues that were here at hand. Because if thinking about the justifications or like rationalizations of why does library lend books, they might end up with more like with this with this justifications connected to the cultural and information value. So books are maybe not that much seen as items as other items in the library. I don't know if I replied to your question
thank
at
you.
all.
Thank you so much.
Other questions, comments? Yeah, not specifically.
Yeah, thanks for interesting presentation. I don't know with your conclusion how much it makes sense to a little bit disentangle the discourses and the discourses of legitimation maybe and justification for the practices, and then the kind of material practices of inclusion or exclusion to the use. Because for instance, I think the things we are talking about in terms of at least justification, they are overdetermined. So there are these powerful narratives of why certain things exist, and I think then actors can justify all kinds of things that are going on with relying to all kinds of different narratives. And I guess like powerful narratives of an effective market economy will then, of course, whatever we do, we can translate into those kinds of ideas. But at the same time, it's not really determined by maybe those kinds of practices. So if there's more of a difference between these discourses that are flowing around and then the material practices of negotiating access and the inclusions and exclusions that these kinds of systems create. I don't know how much that helps. Maybe it's already in your paper. But I was thinking how much these we had in our public library in a small village. We had this intense conflict about whether these mini golf rackets and balls can be borrowed from the library or not. And some were very strongly of the opinion that this has to be a market product. Otherwise, the library will quickly take over everything. And then there was just no entrepreneur that wanted to hire them. No one thought it was a worthwhile thing, and they didn't want to have they didn't want to be open in the summer for so long hours that it was possible. And it became this kind of negotiation of the place of the library. And it felt like this here. Then finally they almost forced this hotel to take over the lending, because the library, as long as everything with the material objects was kind of marginal, it was somehow deemed acceptable. But then so that was my reflection of that. But maybe it's more of a suggestion than a question, or then you can also respond whether that might make any sense. But yeah, I was thinking about the book Powers of Exclusion that I've used a lot in kind of navigating the discourses of legitimation on the one hand, and then the material inclusion exclusion kind of dynamic on the other hand. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great, very interesting, and thank you for the lively example as well. It really reminds me of the data out also interviews with the librarians as also. Yeah, no other responses, but Vijaya had a question.
Yes, hi. Thank you. That was really nice listening to a presentation about libraries, as I'm working on libraries as well. So there was a lot of things. Or I don't work on library, I work on a square, but there is a library on a square. And it's a different situation because it's a self-managed library, so it's not public in that sense. It's not owned. Yeah, it's the whole property thing is very interesting in that relation. And I just wanted to maybe respond a little bit and, I don't know, just give you a little bit of my experience in also thinking about the difference between the books and objects. So in the library where I work, as it is not a traditional library, objects as such is not a part, but there's a lot of materials like toys for kids that are being you can lend. Yes, you can take whenever it's open. So there's skilers and balls and kind of board games and Lego and pens, so you can draw and a lot of stuff, which makes that the library is being frequented by very different people. And for me, this would also be one of the responses to the difference between books and objects. It's the people they attract and the way what you want to teach maybe with that. Instead, like books, as you say, it's a cultural product, but it's also, it kind of relates to an intellectual maybe level. And also when we talk about sharing, it's a different kind of sharing or commenting, as you will. Whereas the objects, I think, at least in my case, it's especially for kids, and they have to learn that if someone takes the skilers, then the next one cannot take them, and they have to wait. And if they all go on with very dirty food, then the next one will not like that. And in the end, everything will spell terrible. And so they need to, in one way or another, learn how to take care of things that are common. So yeah, I know that you didn't really take into account, I guess, in your research, the people who use or come to the library and you make use of objects.
The data here was the interviews of the librarians, but they did talk about the patrons, or and also one kind of a justification linked to the equalizing aim was that actually when offering different types of items other than books, they also enable the library to work to operate like equally, to kind of serve the patrons who wouldn't like to read books, but they would like to borrow items. So that was also one justification linked to the equalizing aim. Yeah, but thank you for it was very nice to hear, and a great comment. Thanks.
Other questions, comments? We can also, if there's any further ideas on the previous presentations and how to combine everything and draw general conclusions about this six presentations, and would be great to hear some comments on that. What brings them together or separates them more? Or in detailed questions and comments are also very welcome. You are the chair, you can summarize. Yes, I have the power. I don't have the skills to summarize. I have the power for my skills. But I think it's been an exciting session, so many perspectives. I will need to refill my notes before I can summarize anything. But I guess many of the questions also towards the end of the session boil down to a question of what to do with this knowledge, because Pieta presented to us kind of these three visions or three interpretations in a way of a similar situation. And kind of you can argue that the same library is participating in at least three different processes at the same time. So I guess the question would be then for me how to go from the perspective of contingency or different histories or different power relations into a specific project, kind of political project of commoning, for instance. And I was thinking in relation to this presentation specifically about whether you could engage librarians and professionals, if that would be one way to kind of elaborate on your research, if you would like to do that, to kind of look into how they envision the kind of futures of lending, and to kind of give them the input of your research, of your results, of those kind of three alternative worlds they're participating in, creating all the time, and kind of ask them to kind of imagine an alternative of what they would like to see, where they would like to see libraries going in terms of lending things, and perhaps creating alternative institutions to private ownership more largely. But maybe that's kind of beyond the scope of your research. If you have any comments on that, I think it would be interesting to hear.
Was there a question? I did.
It belonged more to the comments, not the questions.
Yeah, sounded really interesting. There's small issues in hearing your voices from there. Yeah, it's okay. But one thing that I would like to maybe point out, maybe related to the comment as well, is kind of the vagueness of the ownership or property, or which was also present in Ella's presentation, and how the vagueness may be one part of the kind of why it seems so difficult to make some like a political statements, for example, in the libraries regarding ownership. It's not like in the central. It's not a central political aim for them, but it's like coming to the side of other political aims. And I think maybe it has something to do with the concept and phenomenon as vague and kind of multi-sided, and nobody even knows what we are talking about when we're talking about ownership actually, or property.
Why I think it's so central to have this kind of mapping the diverse economy of post-ownership in a way. But there was Otto had a comment, and then Mariana had a comment. And I'm also having a technical comment that we need to get out of this place before 6 o'clock finish time. So we have 30 minutes to actually stop the session. So, but let's have Otto and then Mariana.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to, yeah, I was inspired by many of the presentations, but something I already wanted to ask during Teppo's presentation, I was noting down. So how do we in those the frameworks or the options that are created, how do we deal with or navigate the question of a kind of more and more unequal distribution of properties and property relations with regard to these notions that were developed? And I was wondering, like Mariana's example of this kind of almost cooperative structured economies of the past, which kind of suggests a kind of quite strong material organizing form of these almost democratically driven organizations, and maybe Pieta's example of so we've managed to kind of have these commons accepted in the world of books. Then what does it take to kind of break through these notions of marginality to actually have an impact on access to resources, maybe more broadly than these say a bit marginal notions of objects that some libraries are testing out. But I think there's like, what do you make of this tension between a kind of increased inequality with regard to ownership and then these the discourses and narratives that you are analyzing? Because I guess the flip side of the coin is then who is owning more if some people are not interested in owning, and the kind of sense that we live in a more and more unequal world, and this is the somehow space where these narratives around property are also shaped, and that feels like the narrative, the kind of relevant flip side of all of these questions. So if someone has thoughts on that, I was curious on that question kind of throughout, and of course, yeah, I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Mariana. You can continue, and we can come back to those questions.
Yeah, it is just also kind of throwing out some thoughts. I was kind of fascinated to hear you speaking about post-ownership idea, and I feel like there is a tension there. So it seems like post-ownership and reluctance of young people, for example, or many others to own material objects is a reaction to private property, right? And it's kind of, you know, probably conservative meanings and all this kind of stuff. At the same time, collective ownership of means of production, like in cooperatives, right? Or collective ownership of housing, in many cases, especially in, I'm speaking about US cities, is a way to resist marginalization, sorry, by racial capitalism, resist gentrification, resist displacement, financial exploitation like credit unions, for example, or exploitation of wage labor. So I feel like you know, there is a lot of different things going on there. And I'm wondering maybe at some point we could talk about those, not here, of course, but in general, like makes me think about all these different meanings of property, right? In very different contexts, and how what works in one may do different thing in another, or at least it would be great to clarify at some point.
Thank you, Mariana. Yes, yeah, I think we need to continue the discussion on other forums, because we also have a trade meeting soon, so we need to catch that with but in any case, thank you everyone. Also, I wanted to say, Mariana, I feel during your presentation, I felt that there is another book coming out soon on the kind of Russian cooperativist history. Hidden history, but that's another story, yet again, another story. Anyway, thank you all for excellent presentations and for this enlightening discussion. Let's continue chatting and discussing and having other sessions. Thank you for convening. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hope to see you soon.
See you.
Yeah, thanks, Tomo, for organizing it. Thanks, everyone.